Hello and welcome to Creative Friday, and this week I'm talking to Jonathan Craymer about his Christian journey with music. So thank you, Jonathan, and welcome, and thank you very much for letting us into your world. So can we go back to the very beginning, born in London I think, to a Jewish father and a Christian mother? An interesting combination. Any pressures there between the two?
Not something I'd recommend necessarily. I think it made my youth quite interesting. I was in contact with the Jewish side of the family quite a lot. I remember enjoying, particularly as a little boy, being included in things like Passover suppers and so on and so forth. But there was a lot of friction between my mother and my grandfather, and he wanted more say in how I was brought up.
Yes.
I mean, some would say I wasn't brought up very well anyway, but yeah, that created an interesting start to life.
And I think you had an interesting neighbour, someone in the music world, someone close by who you was hoping was going to take an interest in your music.
That was when I was at school, so I became an absolute fan of the Shadows, and so the Shadows music and tunes like Apache and so on were absolutely, had me in my bedroom learning the guitar. And Hank Marvin lived fairly near to where I went to school, and we'd got a friend whose barn we used to practice in.
But he didn't discover you?
Sadly not, no.
And then I think eventually you went to Mill Hill School, where you discovered the guitar and you started playing, probably far more than you should have done.
Well, I was already playing the guitar at about age 11. In fact, there was quite a prominent DJ on Capital Radio in his later life, a guy called, well, I won't mention his name, but he's still, I think, a major rock DJ. But he and I had a little band, and he had a snare drum, not a drum kit, and I had a 5-string guitar. And this was at my school before Mill Hill, but yeah, so 1961 onwards.
And I think this is more or less the time when you had your first experience in believing in God.
Correct. Yes. Fairly simply put, one night or one morning, I realised I'd forgotten to do my French homework.
Right.
And Miss Herbert, I remember her name, the French teacher, who's quite a formidable, probably quite youngish woman, quite fierce. And I actually remember praying that she would forget the homework, and she did. So I thought, God, you exist.
Wonderful. And you met Corinne whilst you were at Mill Hill and married in 1974.
Yeah.
And you took a job in commercial radio, where I think you remained for 13 years.
Yes, poor Corinne, in that we got married, and right after we got married, I was at the time working in the stock exchange. I was what's called a blue button,
right, and
a trainee dealer. And at that time, the stock exchange was having a bit of a crash in 1973, 74. So she actually got married to a trainee stock jobber,
right.
And immediately after we got married, I got this job offer for a commercial radio job in Sheffield, and we were at Sheffield house hunting immediately after getting married. So,
right. And then from Sheffield you came to Peterborough, where I think you were a founding member of Hereward Radio.
Correct. Yes. So I'd had a colleague, in Sheffield, Ralph Bernard, who was one of the lead founders of Hereward Radio, and he said, why don't you come down and join us?
Right. And then you became a freelance journalist. Any particular areas of writing, Jonathan? Or
shall I just explain? This is Max, who's really the star. Yeah, look, Max.
Yes.
Yes, I was at Hereward from 1980 to 87. We had companies like EMAP in Peterborough. So I thought I'd rather like to do some more magazine writing. So I wrote to EMAP and they said, come and do some work with us. And so I ended up working with all sorts of titles to do with gardening, motoring, fleet cars. Yeah.
And you had some interesting one-to-one experiences with certain personalities, I think. Can you tell us something about that?
Well, just interesting people I've interviewed. So while I was at Hereward, Margaret Thatcher, when she was still in number 10, went to her old school at Grantham, and of course a serving Prime Minister going back to their old school, very newsworthy, and we got all the cameras from News at 10 and BBC and so on and so on. And she only gave an interview to one person that day, and this is a song that was put together in 1985 when we were actually, I suppose, starting to provide music at St Jude's Church. I know I'm weak and easily led. The ideas I see aren't in my head. I want to be someone who's true, someone who follows the path of you. Oh Jesus, teach me, stretch out and reach me, make me the person I should be. Oh Jesus, take me, please don't forsake me. Let me be what I should be. There's actually two more verses, but I won't bore you with those.
I think that was wonderful, Jonathan. Thank you. You've lost Max in the meantime, but nothing to do with your music, I'm sure.
Of course it is.
No, Jonathan, I think you've had a long connection with St Jude's Church in Netherton. How did all of that begin?
We were sitting at home one evening and Father Richard Giles, who's still a great friend of ours from St Jude's, knocked on the door and said, we want to form a modern music group. And his idea of a modern music group at that time was anybody with a guitar. So I remember about 5 of us all being brought together, some people who couldn't play at all, and we started rehearsing, and then we realised we needed a singer, and I suggested Corinne, and later another lady who played the keyboard joined us, and that large orchestra of guitarists was whittled down to just me and the keyboard, and yeah, so and then we call ourselves Laudamus,
right?
Which I think was one of Richard Giles's suggestions, but then found nobody could pronounce it, so we then changed it to Harvest.
And Corinne was the lead singer there.
Yes.
So how long were you playing at St Jude's and other areas as well?
A long time, probably about 12, 15 years, I think.
But it wasn't just St Jude's, there were other places, very distinguished places that you played.
We were invited to play 3 times in the cathedral. We used to play with United Nations services, and even the chaplain at Cardiff Prison suggested that we should be in the side.
Yes.
And so he even got Home Office money for us to hire a minibus, and we set off to
wonderful
a huge chapel in Cardiff.
And I think that Bishop Bill Westwood took a particular interest in the band.
Yes. I sort of knew him a little bit through Hereward because he would come into the radio station quite a lot. But he joked that, well, I think he was quite serious, that Corinne sounded like Judith Durham from the Seekers, and very, very naughtily he nearly made us crack up with laughter because he was out of sight at the beginning of one service and he said, "Go Judith."
Wonderful. And you were warden at St Jude's for a number of years?
A couple of years.
Yes. And I think you played a major role in seeing that church through a minor crisis in its church life.
Yes, it had a very leaky roof, and I remember Father Douglas Bond, who was our vicar at the time, and I having to literally mop the carpet with towels, and he brought his spin dryer in and so on. And I remember going to the person in charge of Milton Estate, because Milton Estate had contributed to St Jude's building in the first place, and saying we've got a problem. And they said, great, well not great, but here is £2,000. And that started a fund, and we found a wonderful German company with the process which we used. It was called Calico or something, to waterproof the roof. I think more work has had to be done since.
And in 1987, Jonathan, your composing skills were challenged. And tell us something about that.
The then priest at Our Lady of Lourdes Church in Dogsthorpe wanted to stage a musical about St John or Don Bosco, and so he approached me and various others, and we had a lot of people from Cambridgeshire Police in the cast, and for various reasons I ended up composing and writing all the music and all the book and the script, and so we put it on at his church, and Anglia Television had taken an interest. So by the time the performances in 1987 May, we literally had people queuing around the block, and the place was probably
wonderful,
disobeying all fire regs, because we'd literally got people standing around the insides. We got a rock band, and it was so successful that we put it on at the Key Theatre for 3 nights later that year.
And I think Ted Hockeridge had something very kind to say about it.
Well, somebody needed to. He was in the bar one night when we put it on at the Key, and recognising him, I introduced myself, and he said, oh, I came last night as well. And so I said, well, how come you're seeing this show 2 nights running? And he said, I wanted to show my son.
Wonderful.
I thought, oh.
And I think there is someone whom we all know from St Botolph's Church today who was a dancer in your musical.
Yes, indeed. Claire Drake was lead dancer, and actually it went from the Key Theatre to Paisley. I think she was in that production. But yeah. And I didn't even realise until we had a reunion 30 years after the event in 2017, and she'd heard about that. And then one day at St Botolph said, how did the reunion go? I said, well, how do you know about it? She said, I was in it.
Oh, wonderful. Well done, Claire, and well done you. So let's pause there, Jonathan. Well, tell us now, please, how did you first become involved in the life of St Botolph's Church?
It was a very naughty man called Chris Wren, who, well, we'd actually been to an Emmaus course. We were living in South Bretton at the time, and he hosted this course. And I think we were looking for a church at the time, and he'd also got a great interest in something called Casio, which has special weekends, which are wonderful. If you get the chance to go on a Casio weekend, I would recommend it. So through Casio and through this Emmaus course, Chris basically said, why don't you come to St Botolph's? We talked to Father Hayden at the time, who realised we were sort of between churches, and he said, well, just regard this as a place to just chill a bit. And yeah, so that's how we were actually living for a long time in Castor and Aylesworth, but coming to St Botolph's. So we've continued. We've been at St Botolph's, must be 20 years.
Right. And I think there came a time when you felt that some people wanted to worship in a modern way, and you took that idea to Father Hayden. What developed from that, Jonathan?
Well, certainly your good lady wife and people like Pat Hope Jones and others were of a similar mind, and in fact a party of us went to Spring Harvest one year, and I remember a certain person who remained nameless burning the toasted cakes because they didn't realise how the oven worked. But there was a realisation that there were probably nuclei of people in various churches who would like something more modern, but probably not enough. We did actually have a service for a short while on a Sunday night, but I guess many people had been all serviced out by that time. But the idea was to get together with other churches and say, well, look, if we have a sort of modern service on tour around Peterborough, provided you've got toilets and car parking and so on, you're in. Took the idea to Father Hayden, who took it further up the chain, and the idea was born. It was called Peterborough Praise, and it ran very successfully for about 10 years. We had the first one at St Botolph's, November 2001.
Yeah. It sounds as though you're a big believer in evangelism. What does that mean to you in practical terms?
It's very often simply engaging with people and allowing people to ask questions.
Yes.
Very often.
Yes. And I think you were a leading light in leading your church into growth initiative at St Botolph's. You were part of that initiative.
Well, in case people don't know what that is, it's yes, it's a nationwide thing to basically do as I say, to try and enable people to ask questions. And there are an awful lot of people who go to church who have questions to ask. I still remember going to a day of renewal in Norwich, and there was a lady who'd been heavily involved, church warden et al, for 30 years, and she said, I feel angry because nobody ever mentioned having a relationship with God, and I found out about that today.
Yes, wonderful.
Which is awful.
And you've provided music for the Alzheimer's Society and the Dementia Cafe and for Sue Ryder, I believe, and you still are doing so, Jonathan?
Yes. So a Sue Ryder dementia group at their cafe and stand ground hasn't restarted after lockdown, but the lady who organised it has taken that to a community centre and stand ground. So yes, that lives on.
Right. And I've heard whisper, and this is breaking news now, of a ukulele band in Longthorpe. Are you allowed to say anything at this moment, or is it still under wraps?
Well, I think it was Jackie who said she was interested in playing the ukulele, and I've known of the ukulele band that exists in Peterborough through people like John Sandel. And I actually got a couple of ukuleles. Anyway, long story short, we may well form a band, and possibly even with Reverend Jackie. Corinne's interested in learning. The great thing about the ukulele is it's very cheap to buy. You don't have to buy a great big piano or euphonium or anything, and it's very easy to learn. In fact, many of the chords you only need to put one finger on a string and you're able to play.
Very exciting. Jonathan, one thing that I've learned from talking to you today is that faith has taught you to trust in God's providence. Am I right there?
Yes.
Brilliant. Well, thank you so much, Jonathan. We're going to finish with another piece of music. This, I think, is a nursery rhyme that you and Corinne put together yourselves and written for your grandson, Toby. And I think it's called Wash Your Hands.
Yes.
Now, before you sing that, can I say, Jonathan, how very grateful we are to you. And it's been wonderful talking to you. And personally, I've learned so much more about you and your Christian life. So thank you very much.
Thank you. Okay, yes, well, our daughter Lucy said, why don't you and Corinne put together a nursery rhyme? So Corinne wrote the lyrics. Tim Rice would be very jealous, I'm sure, and I wrote the music. And though, of course, many things of lockdown have receded with so-called freedom, obviously the precautions that many of us take still exist. So anyway, this is called Wash Our Hands. Wash our hands, cover our face, lots of space, lots of our hands, cover our face, here we go again. Sing, wash our hands, cover our face, lots of space, wash our hands, cover our face, here we go again, etc.
Thank you, Jonathan.